Naked Mountain, Mountain of Gods, or even Killer Mountain. These are the names and titles that one of the planet's most perilous 8,000ers has earned over recent centuries. Its treacherous slopes have witnessed both fanatical Nazi expeditions and the incredible bravery of a single individual and a devastating terrorist attack that truly shook the entire world. Despite everything, there are still people ready to risk it all to climb this very summit. Greetings to you all. You are watching the channel based on real events. My name is Mikhailo Stak. And today we continue our video series about 8,000er mountains, and this time we'll talk about Nanga Parbat. In this very video, I'll be telling you why Nanga Parbat is considered to be one of the most deadly mountains on our planet, how and why the Nazis strove to reach its summit, about its first scandalous successful ascent, about the most tragic events on its slopes, specifically the dramatic story of the Messner brothers and the terrorist attack that truly shocked the entire world. And, of course, about two films connected to this mountain. Nanga Parbat is the 9th highest peak on the planet, rising to 8,126 meters above sea level. It is located in a mountain range in the northwest Himalayas, within Pakistan. And it's also one of the most western Great Himalayan mountains. Nanga Parbat is therefore often regarded as the symbolic western gateway to the Himalayas. The mountain's name itself comes from the Sanskrit words Nanga Parvata, meaning naked mountain. That's precisely how its steep slopes were once described, especially the southern one, which frequently remains free of snow. The local inhabitants, however, refer to this mountain as Diamir or Diomir. In various different sources, this particular name is explained in diverse ways. Some interpretations translate it as Mountain of Gods, while others render it as King of Mountains. At the same time, this peak is one of the deadliest 8,000ers. And just like Annapurna, Nanga Parbat is often called the Killer Mountain, due to the many tragedies that occurred on its slopes, especially in the first decades of climbing attempts. The reputation of the Killer Mountain became so firmly established that in interwar Europe, Nanga Parbat was spoken of with mystical dread and a sense of fatalism. But even in the 21st century, in more recent times, death and horror have not abandoned the mountain's slopes. For example, in 2013, a terrorist attack occurred at the base camp, which I will tell you a little more about later. Overall, Nanga Parbat truly stands out among other 8,000ers due to its immense scale and incredibly challenging vertical terrain. On the mountain's southern side is the famous Rupal Wall. It's a massive slope that rises almost directly from its base to the peak, over 4,600 meters. Due to its immense scale, the Rupal Wall is often called the world's highest mountain face. And it frightens climbers not only with its scale, but also because it's easy to get caught in rock falls, ice falls, and avalanches. On the northern side of Nanga Parbat, there is a complex, relatively gentle Raikot slope. From the foot of the Indus River Valley all the way to its summit, it gains approximately 7,000 meters in height. And all of this occurs over a distance of just about 25 kilometers. That is precisely why this ascent is considered one of the greatest elevation changes on Earth. In simpler terms, the mountain quite literally rises directly above the valley floor. The western and northwestern slopes of the mountain form the side called Diamir. It is there that the route lies, currently considered the easiest ascent path compared to others. And at the same time, it was mostly there that events occurred which secured the mountain its ominous reputation. In reality, no side of Nanga Parbat can be called safe. The terrain is everywhere broken by glaciers, full of crevasses, overhanging ice blocks that could collapse at any moment, narrow chutes on the slope prone to frequent avalanches, and even unstable snow slopes. The climate in the Nanga Parbat area also does not contribute to safety. Unlike Everest or other peaks in Nepal, where the primary climbing season is during May and October, the weather here can be much more unpredictable. The mountain is situated directly in the path of the monsoons, which in the summer months bring humid air from the Indian Ocean. During June and July, the slopes of Nanga Parbat frequently experience heavy snowfalls and fierce squally winds, making the full summer climbing season exceedingly brief. Usually, climbers try to make their ascents in early June or at the beginning of autumn, specifically to avoid the monsoon's peak. But even these weather windows, both in spring and fall, are quite treacherous here. They can suddenly close due to a storm or heavy snowfall, trapping people on their climbing route. Unlike popular commercial 8,000ers, such as Mount Everest, where the routes are technically quite simple and are well equipped with fixed ropes, Nanga Parbat, on the other hand, forgives neither technical errors nor any hesitation or delay. Evacuating those who are injured here is exceptionally challenging. The mountain is encircled by extremely rugged and inaccessible terrain, and helicopters are only able to fly in absolutely ideal weather conditions. Furthermore, the region itself has historically experienced significant security problems due to the activities of extremist groups. Collectively, all of these factors make Nanga Parbat an incredibly dangerous summit to attempt. By the way, commercial expeditions with guides and Sherpas were a rarity here for a considerable period, owing to the significant risks and persistent dangers. However, the initial references to Nanga Parbat in European sources emerged towards the close of the 19th century, precisely coinciding with the commencement of the grand exploration era for the Himalayas and other 8,000er peaks. Even as far back as 1895, the British mountaineer Albert Mummery led a small expedition to the foot of Nanga Parbat, and this was, in fact, the very first known human attempt to ascend a peak above 8,000 meters. Mummery was considered one of the strongest mountaineers of his era, renowned simultaneously for his adventurous spirit. He then decided to thoroughly explore the approaches to the mountain from the Diamir side. Upon arriving there, having traversed long and arduous mountain passes, Mummery's team quickly came to realize that the chosen path was extraordinarily difficult. Therefore, they then moved to the northern side of the mountain and attempted to ascend along the Raikot Glacier. But, as far as is known, they did not manage to reach any significant altitude. And simultaneously, this very first expedition also marked the first recorded tragedy on the mountain. During this reconnaissance, Mummery and 2 guides vanished in the glacier area, never to be seen again, their bodies never found. They likely perished in an avalanche or fell into a glacial crevasse. This early disaster effectively discouraged other Europeans for many years from attempting to climb the bare mountain. Despite the fact that in the following decades a period of great expeditions to the 8,000ers began, no nation organized a large-scale assault on Nanga Parbat until the First World War. The mountain massif remained largely unexplored. The first maps were created and information was gathered from local shepherds about its glaciers and mountain passes, but there was no clear understanding of the key to the summit. The situation underwent a change in the 1930s. Following the First World War, when the Himalayas once again became accessible for expeditions, various nations symbolically selected their own national peaks of prestige. The British concentrated their efforts on Everest, the French on the Annapurna Massif located in Nepal, and the Italians subsequently focused on K2. And Germany was allotted Nanga Parbat, situated in what was then British India, yet relatively accessible to non-British expeditions. In Berlin, the idea quickly took hold to conquer the first 8,000er ever, specifically under the German flag. The press dubbed Nanga Parbat Schicksalsberg, the Mountain of Destiny, the German nation's ultimate goal. Grandiose appeals were proclaimed, and these were accompanied by government funds and even the direct personal support of Heinrich Himmler, who personally oversaw the mountaineers, treating them as the Reich's elite soldiers. The first attempt was made in 1932, led by Willy Merkel, an experienced Bavarian alpinist. The climbers ascended to 7,000 meters, but found their path blocked by difficult rock and ice ridges. The team lacked high-altitude experience, and as the weather worsened, the expedition retreated. Despite the failure, Merkel didn't lose his enthusiasm. He deemed the trek a useful reconnaissance, proving the route through Rakiot was, in principle, feasible. Just 2 years later, Willy Merkel returned to Nanga Parbat, leading a much more powerful expedition. This time, Nazi organizations funded the team. The equipment was better, and the roster included Germany's and Austria's strongest climbers. They were joined by a team of cartographer scientists and experienced Sherpas who had previously worked on Everest. Merkel's expedition that year became a true siege of Nanga Parbat. For weeks, people carried loads from base camp to high camps, fixing ropes on key ice walls. The efforts paid off. In July, 2 expedition members, Aschenbrenner and Schneider, reached an altitude of almost 7,900 meters. It was a record altitude then, almost at the summit's final push. But then, disaster suddenly struck. A powerful cyclone suddenly spoiled the weather. An incredibly powerful snowstorm began on the mountain. 16 expedition members became trapped in one of the high-altitude camps at an elevation of about 7,500 meters. They were exhausted and buried under snow. The rest of the team, who were lower down, tried to push their way up to help, but the forces of nature were stronger. The fierce storm continued for more than a week. The temperatures dropped sharply, and their food supplies were completely depleted. Only a very few individuals, by some miracle, managed to make their way down and be rescued. However, in all, 10 participants of the expedition ultimately lost their lives. And among those who died was the expedition's leader, Willy Merkel. Some perished from exhaustion and the bitter cold. Others, perhaps, plunged down into the raging blizzard. And this tragedy shocked the entire world. In 1934, it became the single deadliest incident in the history of mountaineering. Germany declared a period of national mourning for the climbers, designating them as martyrs and heroes. But she certainly didn't give up on the idea of climbing the mountain. The question of national prestige for Nazi Germany was far more important than a few lost lives. So, soon after, other Germans followed, under the close supervision and full support of the Hitler regime. 3 years later, Germany organized a new team under the leadership of Karl Wien. But this time, fate proved even crueler. In June of 1937, when a group of 7 German alpinists and 9 Sherpas were at a high-altitude camp on one of the glacier's steps, at approximately 6,300 meters, a gigantic avalanche suddenly descended from the Rakiot wall. A huge mass of snow and ice collapsed, burying the camp. The people didn't even get a chance to react. All 16 men, including their leader Wien and the renowned mountaineer Adolf Gottner, perished instantly. And then, a new cycle began. A national tragedy in Germany. And just 1 year later, a new German team was on the mountain slopes. After all, it was just one mountain, and there were still plenty of Germans. So, in 1938, the Nazis sent another expedition led by Paul Bauer, who, mindful of his predecessors, proceeded more cautiously. His team reached 7,500 meters, where bad weather then stopped them. However, surprisingly, no casualties this time. Bauer gave the order to descend in time. Whether the Nazi leadership reprimanded him for it afterwards is unknown. But by then, Germany was already making more ambitious plans to conquer Europe, so the mountain receded into the background. However, it's also worth noting that in 1939, another small reconnaissance took place. Young Austrian mountaineers, Heinrich Harrer and Fritz Kufsteiner, arrived at Nanga Parbat. They had ambitious plans to find and explore a new climbing route from the western face. However, they couldn't even begin their serious ascent because World War II broke out, and the British authorities in India immediately started detaining German and Austrian nationals. As a result, Harrer and Aufschneider ended up in a prisoner of war camp from which they later escaped and eventually found themselves in Tibet. And this remarkable odyssey undertaken by Harrer formed the very foundation for the celebrated autobiographical book, 7 Years in Tibet. This literary work, in turn, served as the inspiration for the well-known film of the same name, starring Brad Pitt, which was released to audiences in 1997. Regardless, by the close of the 1930s, this formidable killer mountain, it had already accounted for nearly 30 dead, mostly Germans, and with no success. Following the Second World War, the Nazi regime itself vanished into oblivion. However, despite all of this, the ambitious idea to achieve the first successful German ascent of Nanga Parbat outlived both Hitler and Himmler. As early as 1953, a significant expedition once again arrived at the base of Nanga Parbat. This time, it hailed from West Germany and Austria, under the leadership of Dr. Karl Herrlichhofer. For Herrlichhofer, this was truly a matter of honor. His stepbrother, Willy Merkel, had tragically died there in 1934, and now Karl was determined to see the mission through to its completion. However, this time, despite extensive preparations and a great deal of equipment, the outcome of the expedition was determined by a single individual. After a full month of strenuous work, in July, the expeditionary team successfully established their pre-summit camp at an altitude of approximately 7,000 meters. From there, the very next day, 2 climbers, Hermann Buhl and Otto Kempter, set out with the clear intention of making their summit push the following day. However, the other expedition members, sensing the imminent arrival of the monsoon, began to strongly insist on abandoning the ascent, and ultimately, a significant conflict arose. The leader of the assault group, Aschenbrenner, who was well aware of the potential tragedy that a sudden change in weather on this mountain could bring, commanded everyone to descend, considering the risk of attempting the summit so late in the day to be far too great. But Buhl, disagreeing with this decision, resolved to proceed to the summit by himself, ignoring all previous orders. And this was a desperate move, as no one had ever soloed an 8,000er before. So Buhl, with just minimal gear, an ice axe, some food, a camera, a Pakistani flag to plant on the summit, and pervitin and padutin pills, went up. Pervitin was a powerful stimulant drug containing methamphetamine. It was extensively utilized by the German armed forces throughout the Second World War for enhancing vigilance and to alleviate the effects of combat fatigue. And spiderwebs were then considered a remedy that dilates blood vessels, improves circulation, and thereby was supposed to reduce the risk of frostbite. Buhl did not use oxygen. At that time, alpinists doubted the necessity of oxygen apparatuses, although on Everest that same year, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay reached the summit precisely with oxygen. Even though the monsoon was approaching, the weather was quite favorable for Buhl, and he advanced rather swiftly and without any significant difficulties. He managed to reach the Silver Saddle Pass, then ascended the so-called shoulder, and on July 3rd, around 7 in the evening, he single-handedly stepped onto Nanga Parbat's peak. There, he firmly secured and then photographed his ice axe, adorned with the flag of Pakistan, thereby documenting his extraordinary achievement. Essentially, at that moment, Hermann Buhl accomplished the impossible. He ascended over 1,000 meters in altitude during one incredibly long day, entirely alone and without any specialized equipment. Surprisingly, the descent in the dark proved far more difficult and perilous for the climber. An exhausted Buhl was forced to spend the night at 7,900 meters without a tent or sleeping bag, standing on a tiny snow ledge. It was a deadly bivouac, practically in the death zone. According to memoirs, Buhl several times fell into a semi-sleep, semi-delirium, saw hallucinations, and prayed to live until dawn. And he did. The next morning, he gathered his remaining strength and continued his descent to the camp, which he barely reached in the evening, having spent a total of 41 hours in motion and on the ice practically without sleep. His excited and surprised teammates met him there. This ascent became a legend in world mountaineering. For the first time, Nanga Parbat was successfully summited, 58 years after Mamari's first attempt. Secondly, a solo climber did it, without oxygen, defying the siege tactics that dominated all 8,000ers then. This approach would later be known as the Alpine style, with Buhl being one of the very first to employ it. Notably, among all 14 of the world's 8,000er peaks, this remains the sole instance where the initial summit ascent was achieved by a single individual. Nevertheless, Buhl had to pay a heavy price. The severe frostbite on his feet resulted in the loss of several of his toes. And, quite predictably, following the expedition's return, a clear and open conflict quickly developed between its leader, Karl Herrlichhofer, and Hermann Buhl. Despite the historical success, the expedition leader viewed such independence as a violation of orders and an undermining of authority, while Buhl saw it as the only way to save the chance at the summit. And it didn't end there. According to witnesses, Herrlichhofer met the expedition's star quite coldly, and later, in public, even tried not to overemphasize Buhl's role in this success. In response, Buhl decided to tell his version of events and began to act without the leader's approval. He gave lectures and prepared his own book about the ascent. And at this point, not only emotions came into play, but also the formalities, the agreements, and the contracts concerning who had the right to publicly utilize the expedition's story, meaning to publish texts, to perform, and to earn money from it. It was precisely because of this that the argument moved into the legal arena. To Herrlichhofer, this appeared as a clear breach of terms and an undermining of the official version. For Buhl, however, it was his right to tell his own story of the ascent, which he accomplished virtually alone and despite the immense pressure. However, in the end, everything was resolved through a peaceful agreement between the parties. Buhl himself, just 4 years after his successful ascent, tragically perished on a different peak in the Karakoram range. But his solo feat on Nanga Parbat would forever remain a legendary chapter in the history of mountaineering. For some, it's one of the most striking examples of human courage, but for others, of recklessness. After Hermann Buhl's ascent, Nanga Parbat was no longer an inaccessible peak, yet it never became easy. Another successful ascent occurred only 9 years later. It was then that the route from the Diemer side, now considered a classic, was first successfully ascended. Karl Herrlichhofer once again assembled a team and led them to the mountain's west face. 3 climbers then managed to reach the summit via a new path. However, even this triumph was not without its tragedy. During the descent, one of the climbers who had reached the summit, Siegfried Löw, exhausted and severely frostbitten, slipped on the ice and plunged into the abyss. Then in 1970, they finally made an attempt to conquer the previously unassailable Rupal face. The expedition was once again organized by Herrlichhofer, and it went down in history as one of the most dramatic mountaineering ascents. Among the participants at that time were 2 Italian brothers from South Tyrol, 25-year-old Reinhold and 24-year-old Günther Messner. They were renowned for their daring ascents in the Alps, but had never before climbed to heights exceeding 8,000 meters. The team planned to assault the summit via a new route, directly through the center of the Rupal face. This involved over 4,500 meters of almost vertical ascent. Throughout June, the mountaineers were forging a path up the wall, establishing camps one after another. The Messner brothers were actively engaged in this demanding process. And then, on June 26, 1970, while at the 5th high-altitude camp at an elevation of more than 7,000 meters, Reinhold Messner decided to attempt what Hermann Buhl had successfully accomplished in the past. To go against the orders of leader Karl Herrlichhofer and independently storm the summit. He later explained his decision by saying that he had decided to take advantage of the relatively good weather and proceeded with the summit attempt by himself, aiming to outpace the predicted worsening of conditions without bringing either a tent or sufficient gear. He intended to move through rapidly and complete the ascent in pure alpine style. However, A little later, his brother Günther, without awaiting explicit instructions, impulsively set off to follow Reinhold. And the very next day, after their midday meal, the two Messner brothers, for the first time ever, reached the summit of Nanga Parbat from the Rupel face. But at the summit, their troubles truly began. Günther, the younger brother, was completely exhausted and showing clear signs of altitude sickness, so descending by the same path would have been incredibly difficult. Therefore, the Messners made the decision to descend down the opposite slope, specifically on the Diamir side. This meant undertaking a full traverse of the entire mountain, which implied not returning along their original route, but rather crossing the massive peak and making their descent from the other side. It was a highly perilous journey into the unknown, though with less steep cliffs. The Messner brothers spent 2 nights at high altitude, without a tent, on the very brink of life and death. It was only on June 29th that Reinhold, completely exhausted and utterly spent, descended into the Diamir Valley, where he was discovered by local shepherds. Günther was no longer with him. According to Reinhold, his brother had perished during the descent. He either got caught in an avalanche on the glacier, or he fell down. It's not precisely known, as Reinhold was walking a bit ahead and did not witness the moment. He claimed he himself was balancing on the edge of consciousness. He lost 7 toes due to frostbite. One way or another, Günther Messner remained on the mountain forever. However, this drama also had a rather unpleasant aftermath. The other members of the expedition, who, incidentally, had also successfully ascended to the summit by a different route, accused Reinhold of supposedly abandoning his own brother in pursuit of the glory of a solo climb. The expedition leader, Gerlin Koffler, and in particular participants Max von Kienlin and Hans Seiler openly expressed their doubts that Günther had actually reached the summit at all, and they speculated that he might have perished earlier during the ascent from the Rupel face. Reinhold Messner vehemently denied these accusations. The disputes lasted for decades and even escalated into lawsuits and a battle of books. It wasn't until 2005 that casual climbers found Günther Messner's remains. They were found in a glacial rockfall on the Diamir side, roughly where Reinhold had said. And later, DNA tests confirmed it was Günther. And this is what finally put an end to the main dispute. The younger Messner had in fact crossed to the mountain's western side and perished there, just as his brother had always maintained. However, there are other details. Did Reinhold act correctly when he went to the summit alone, without coordinating it with the team, and did not stop his brother when he decided to follow? Could Günther have been saved? Did he truly fall ill with altitude sickness at the summit? Whether Reinhold, high up on the mountain, was truly compelled to make the agonizing decision to leave his younger brother to perish and save only himself so that both would not ultimately die, these will forever remain profound questions without any definitive or clear answer. Reinhold Messner subsequently authored a book titled The Naked Mountain, in which he emotionally detailed his personal account of these tragic events. On Iter des Arts, and in 2010, German director Josef Wilsmeyer shot a feature film called Nanga Parbat. Reinhold Messner himself actively consulted the filmmakers throughout the movie's production. The film showed the story through Reinhold's eyes. It revealed the brothers' complex bond, their mutual support, and the final tragedy, but somewhat simplified the portrayal of other participants. For instance, the legendary Nanga Parbat expedition leader Karl Herrlich Koffer is portrayed almost as a caricatured bureaucratic villain and an old tyrant. However, the actual reality, of course, was significantly more complex. At the very same time, several genuine members of this expedition's team, as well as Karl Herrlich Koffer's own son, quite openly declared that the film was distorting the truth and inaccurately portraying the individuals involved. At the same time, mountaineer Gerhard Bauer, a participant in this expedition and the man who last saw the Messner brothers together, made it clear that the film relies exclusively on Reinhold's version. They claimed Günther fell ill at high altitude, and it was only out of sheer desperation that they descended not by their planned route, but instead via the Diamir face. However, Bauer stressed that he did not believe this crucial explanation, and had not believed it from the very beginning, because according to his own words, he had heard a different story on multiple occasions. Apparently, even before that, while climbing in the high-altitude camps, Reinhold, with his eyes gleaming, spoke of the traverse, of crossing the entire mountain as the very next step in the world of alpinism, as a concept that was truly worth attempting. And according to Bauer's account, Messner, for some unknown reason, fails to mention this in any of his published books. So, to all the questions without a clear-cut answer, yet another one has been added. Is it possible that Reinhold Messner and his brother chose to ascend the Diamir side rather than descending the Rupel face, not out of sheer desperation or Günther's severe illness, but driven by Reinhold's personal ambition to achieve a full mountain traverse which tragically concluded in disaster? However, these are still just versions. The film Nanga Parbat, by the way, received mixed, mostly negative reviews from critics and viewers. Despite all this and such a dark chapter in his biography, Reinhold Messner, after that tragic expedition, became one of the key innovators of high-altitude mountaineering. This mountain, in many ways, shaped his entire journey. 8 years later, Messner returned to Nanga Parbat and successfully completed a solo ascent without any support or supplemental oxygen, utilizing a rapid alpine style. This was the first ever solo ascent of an 8,000er in history, from its very base all the way to the summit. And he later became the first person in history to achieve the unofficial mountaineering title, Crown of the Earth, which means he successfully climbed all 14 of the world's highest peaks, the 8,000ers. After achieving this historic feat, Messner then decided to take on the challenge of conquering deserts. He traversed Antarctica, Greenland, the vast Taklamakan Desert in China, and successfully reached both the North and South Poles. He later even became a member of the European Parliament. But the story of the 1970 expedition forever became one of those chapters in his biography that caused, and still cause, considerable public interest. In the 70s and 80s, many strong teams came to Nanga Parbat to forge new, ever more challenging routes. Notably, in 76, Austrians led by Hans Schell opened a new path along the Rupel Face's southeast ridge, known as the Schell Route. It is a longer route, but it avoids the most hazardous areas of suspended glaciers. Today, this has become a popular choice on the South Face, even though it's still quite challenging. In 1985, a Polish expedition led by Paweł Mularz completed an incredibly challenging route along the southeast face of the Rupel Wall, which was an almost sheer pillar of ice and rock stretching from its very base all the way to the summit. Participating in the assault was the legendary Polish alpinist Jerzy Kukuczka, who was the second person in the world after Messner to have ascended all 14 of the planet's 8,000ers. However, the expedition was not without losses. During work on the lower sections, one of the poles died in an avalanche. Until the beginning of the 21st century, Nanga Parbat, like all other 8,000ers in Pakistan, remained a summer mountain. In winter, no one dared to go to such heights, especially to that deadly peak. Polish alpinists have been setting records in the winter Himalayas ever since the 1980s. They were even given the nickname of Ice Warriors. However, Nanga Parbat proved to be a challenge for them for a very long time. The cold months here are a true snowy hell. Temperatures drop to a staggering -50 degrees. Storms have been raging for weeks, and the brief daylight hours don't provide the opportunity to work for long periods on the mountain. Prior to this, from 2010 onwards, every year several teams attempted to make a winter ascent. And finally, it was not until 2016 that the Italian Simone Moro, the Basque Alex Chicon, and the Pakistani climber Ali Satpara were able to achieve the summit of Nanga Parbat for the very first time in history during the winter season. Moro himself described this particular victory as the most challenging one of his entire professional career. Winter Nanga Parbat required a much higher degree of endurance and skill than a winter ascent of Everest or K2, as participants recounted. But if that year brought a joyful victory, then just 2 years later, French alpinist Elisabeth Revol and Polish alpinist Tomasz Makiewicz became involved in far more dramatic events. They successfully completed the second winter ascent of Nanga Parbat. But during their descent, Tomek began to show symptoms of snow blindness and severe altitude sickness. He lost his sight and could barely stand. Elizabeth tried with all her might to bring her partner down, but realized she couldn't save him alone. So she left Matskevich in a snow cave at about 7,300 meters and began to descend to call for help. Fortunately, she managed to send a distress signal. Thus began an unprecedented rescue operation. From the base camp below K2, another mountain hundreds of kilometers away, a military helicopter transported 4 Polish climbers, who were wintering there, directly to Nanga Parbat. 2 of them, Denis Urubko and Adam Bilecki, volunteered and rushed to the rescue. At night, the 2 of them climbed almost a kilometer up the slopes of Nanga Parbat in the dark, battling frost and wind, and found Elizabeth Revol alive at roughly 6,000 meters and brought her down to the camp, where a helicopter arrived for them in the morning. But Tomasz Makiewicz remained on the mountain. Rescuers couldn't reach him due to worsening weather and their exhaustion, so he essentially received no help and died there. Then the world was abuzz with news of this incredible rescue on the Killer Mountain. But at the same time, the question of moral choice was raised once again, as one person was saved at the cost of a conscious decision to leave another to die. And the very next year, another tragedy occurred. Italian Daniele Nardi and Briton Tom Ballard were attempting to be the first to traverse the infamous Mummery Spur, a direct route located precisely where Mummery himself had vanished back in the late 19th century. And sadly, they tragically repeated the fate of their predecessors, disappearing on the mountain wall during a severe storm. Their bodies were later discovered with the help of drones. At the same time, it was a tragic coincidence that Tom Ballard was the son of the legendary British mountaineer Alison Hargreaves, who herself perished on K2 in the 90s. And her son, tragically, met a similar fate on a different Pakistani peak. Over many decades, the number of Nanga Parbat's victims has become quite substantial. Currently, the death toll is already approaching 100, while successful ascents to the summit are almost 400. Historically, this 8,000er had one of the world's highest mortality rates, the ratio of deaths to successful summit attempts. Even before the first successful ascent, the mountain claimed over 36 lives. Subsequently, statistics improved somewhat, but it's still striking. Based on various data and different calculation methods, between 20 and 28% of all mountaineers who attempted to climb Nanga Parbat did not make it back. For comparison, on Mount Everest, this percentage historically fluctuates within 5%. As of today, after several relatively calm seasons, the success rate stands at approximately 20%. However, it's important to understand that modern equipment and weather forecasting have significantly improved the chances of success. In recent years, an increasing number of experienced mountaineers have successfully ascended Nanga Parbat without encountering tragic incidents. However, it goes without saying that no one is truly safe from danger. For instance, in June of 2017, two highly experienced high-altitude climbers, the Spaniard Alberto Zerain and the Argentinian Mariano, tragically perished in an avalanche, despite their extensive preparation. For this reason, Nanga Parbat is often regarded as a summit only for the chosen few, where there's no place for mass tourism. Unlike Everest or even K2, you'll very rarely encounter queues of commercial clients here. And interestingly, this isn't solely due to natural dangers. Specifically, we're talking about events that occurred in June 2013 and which truly shook the entire world. At that time, a group of armed extremists launched an attack on the base camp, located on the Dayamir side. Mountaineers from various countries were staying at this camp as they were preparing for their mountain ascent. Around midnight, militants dressed in the uniforms of local security forces broke into the camp and started shooting the foreign visitors. A total of 11 people died then. Only 2 miraculously survived. One Chinese man managed to escape and hide, while a Latvian citizen was outside the camp at the time of the attack and did not fall into the hands of the militants. Responsibility for the assault was claimed by a Pakistani Taliban militant group, declaring it was an act of revenge for the killing of one of their leaders by an American drone strike. Following that assault, Pakistani authorities carried out several special operations and even apprehended a number of the attackers. However, the majority of those responsible were never brought to justice. Some of those who had been arrested were actually released, while others simply could not be located at all. This particular incident dealt a very severe blow to the entire region's reputation. Expeditions scheduled for the subsequent years were massively cancelled, and tourists completely stopped visiting, even for ordinary mountain hikes. Ultimately, the government was compelled to implement unprecedented security measures for safety. Foreign mountaineers at the base camp began to be protected by an armed police detachment, and groups of tourists heading to the observation points were escorted by armed guides. Gradually, confidence was partially restored, as that particular attack was more of an isolated incident, given that this is generally a historically peaceful region quite distant from active combat zones. Nevertheless, a certain level of risk still persisted in any event. For the Ukrainian community, this tragedy was especially painful, because among the killed were well-known alpinists who glorified Ukraine on Himalayan peaks: Ihor Sverhun, Badavi Kashayev, and Dmitro Konyayev. Igor Svergon, for example, was the leader of the Kharkiv-based Vertical Mountaineering Club. He possessed extensive experience and considerable authority, and it was precisely he who headed this tragic international expedition. Their names are now etched upon memorials, and Nanga Parbat has added another tragic chapter to its history. As I have already mentioned, the commercialization that has enveloped Mount Everest with its endless queues and full-service all-inclusive packages only reached Nanga Parbat in the most recent years. And even then, it has been done with great caution and in a very limited way. There are known cases when commercial groups came here, particularly with Nepalese Sherpas, but overall the requirements remained high. Most clients still had to be very experienced and self-sufficient in the mountains. So, for now, this mountain still holds its reputation for true sports alpinism, and you can't just come here for a photo or a pretty story. Without skill, endurance, and the willingness to take serious risks, you'll have almost no chance here. And with that, I'll be wrapping up my episode for today. If you found it interesting, please don't forget to hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so yet. And for now, that's all. So, until our next meeting on YouTube.